The boat sat in dry dock for 43 years, painted and repainted, its hull scraped and varnished, its engine maintained with religious devotion, and it never once touched water. I discovered this on a humid afternoon in July when I was supposed to be sorting through my grandfather's estate, deciding what to keep and what to sell and what to simply throw away. The brutal arithmetic of death that reduces a life to boxes and receipts and things no one wants, but no one can bear to discard. The boat was in a warehouse near the harbor in Biloxi, Mississippi, listed on a lease agreement. I found in a filing cabinet paid faithfully every month for over 4 decades, a steady drain of money for a vessel that served no purpose I could understand. When I finally tracked down the warehouse and saw the boat, a 32-foot cabin cruiser named the Persistence, gleaming white with blue trim, sitting on blocks like a monument to intention without action, I stood there trying to understand what kind of man spends half his life maintaining a boat he never sails. What kind of dream requires endless preparation but no fulfillment? What kind of promise to himself my grandfather had made and then spent decades neither keeping nor breaking, just holding in suspension, always ready, never departing. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. My name is David Brennan, and I came to Biloxi because my grandfather, Thomas Brennan, died alone in a hospital room on a Tuesday morning in June 2023, and someone needed to deal with the aftermath. I was that someone by default, his only grandchild, the last living family member who still spoke to him, which wasn't saying much since we'd exchanged maybe 20 words in the past 5 years. My father had been estranged from him since before I was born, some old argument that neither would discuss and neither would forgive. My mother stayed neutral by staying absent. And me? I'd visited occasionally as a kid, stopped visiting as a teenager, reconnected briefly in college, and then let the relationship drift into annual Christmas cards and the occasional phone call neither of us really wanted to make. But blood is blood, and death makes you responsible in ways life doesn't. So when the hospital called to say Thomas Brennan had passed and I was listed as next of kin, I took a week off work, flew from Chicago to Gulfport, and drove to Biloxi with the grim determination of someone doing their duty without expecting anything from it, except the satisfaction of having done it. The funeral was sparsely attended, a few elderly neighbors, a woman from the VFW post, the lawyer handling the estate, and me. The minister was generic, speaking in platitudes about a man he'd clearly never met, and the whole affair had the hollow quality of a formality performed without conviction. Thomas Brennan had lived 87 years, worked as a machinist for 40 of them, retired in 1980, and then apparently spent the next 4 decades doing very little that left any trace on the world. No wife, she died in 1977. No other children besides my father. No obvious hobbies or passions except, apparently, maintaining a boat he never sailed. After the funeral, I met with the lawyer, a tired-looking man named Wilcox, who had an office above a pawn shop downtown. He laid out the estate, which was simple enough. The house, fully paid off, but worth almost nothing in Biloxi's depressed real estate market. A modest savings account, a small pension that died with him, and various personal effects. And the boat, and the warehouse lease. He never missed a payment, Wilcox said, shuffling through papers. 43 years, every month, like clockwork. I asked him once, this was maybe 10 years ago, asked him why he didn't just sell it if he wasn't using it. He looked at me like I'd suggested he sell his kidneys. Said the boat wasn't for using. Said it was for having. For having? His words. Didn't elaborate. Your grandfather wasn't much for elaborating. Wilcox pushed a key across the desk. That's for the warehouse. Unit 17. The lease is paid through the end of the year. After that, you'll need to either renew it or sell the boat, or just haul it to the scrapyard. Your choice. I took the key, a simple brass thing on a ring with a tag that said 17 in faded marker, and I wondered what I was supposed to do with a boat I didn't want that my grandfather had apparently loved too much to ever actually use. The house came first. I spent 2 days going through it, a small 2-bedroom ranch on a street where half the properties were abandoned and the other half were hanging on by sheer stubbornness. The interior was neat, almost obsessively so. Everything in its place, nothing extraneous. The furniture was old, but maintained. The kitchen was clean. The bedroom where my grandfather had slept held a single bed made with hospital quarters, a dresser with clothes folded precisely, a knitstand with a lamp, and a Bible that looked unread. I found photos in a closet my grandmother before she died. My father as a child, me as a baby in pictures I'd never seen. But there was a gap, a period from about 1978 onward where the photos stopped, as if my grandfather had decided to stop documenting his life the year after his wife died, or as if the life worth documenting had ended then, and what came after was just epilogue, time to be filled but not recorded. I found financial records going back decades, meticulously kept in ledgers before computers, and then in printed spreadsheets after. The warehouse lease appeared every month, a consistent line item, never questioned or analyzed, just paid. And I found something else, buried in the back of a desk drawer. A brochure for a sailing school in Key West, dated 1979, with a note in my grandfather's handwriting. Start September. Finally time. But there was no evidence he'd ever gone. No certificates, no photos of him on a boat, nothing to suggest he'd followed through. Just the brochure, preserved for 44 years, a fragment of an intention that had somehow transformed into the boat in the warehouse and 4 decades of maintenance. On the 3rd day, I went to see the boat. The warehouse was in an industrial area near the harbor, a corrugated metal building that looked like it dated from the 1960s and hadn't been updated since. Unit 17 was in the back, accessed through a rolling door secured with a padlock. The key worked smoothly. The lock was well maintained, recently oiled. When I rolled the door up, light flooded into a space that held only the boat, sitting on blocks, surrounded by carefully organized tools and supplies. The persistence was beautiful. That was the first thing that struck me. The hull was pristine, the paint glossy, the chrome fixtures polished. Someone my grandfather obviously had loved this boat with a devotion that showed in every detail. The deck was clean, the lines were coiled perfectly, the windows were spotless. It looked ready to launch, ready to sail, ready for the voyage it had never taken. I climbed the ladder leaning against the hull and stepped onto the deck. The fiberglass was solid under my feet. No soft spots, no signs of deterioration. I opened the cabin door and stepped inside. The interior was as pristine as the exterior. The galley had a small stove, a sink, a refrigerator that presumably didn't work since there was no power connection. The table was polished teak. The berths had cushions that looked new, protected by plastic covers. There were life jackets in a locker, all up to date, all in good condition. Navigation charts were rolled and stored in a tube. A radio was mounted above the navigation station, and when I turned it on, expecting nothing, it powered up, glowing softly. Everything was ready. Everything was prepared. The boat could have been launched that afternoon and sailed away without any additional work. It had been ready for 43 years. Ready and waiting and going nowhere. I sat at the navigation station, trying to understand. The boat represented a significant investment, not just the original purchase price, but decades of maintenance, storage fees, replacement parts. The financial records I'd found suggested my grandfather hadn't been wealthy. He'd lived modestly, saved carefully, and devoted a substantial portion of his income to keeping this boat in perfect condition. Why? There was a logbook in a drawer, and I opened it hoping for answers. But the entries were purely technical dates: when the hull had been waxed, when the engine had been serviced, when various systems had been inspected and maintained. There was no narrative, no explanation, no hint of what this boat meant or why it mattered. Just data, as if the boat were a project requiring documentation, but not interpretation. I sat there in the cabin for over an hour in a boat that had never moved, surrounded by equipment that had never been used, and I tried to feel some connection to the grandfather. I'd barely known to understand what this monument to perpetual preparation meant to him, but I felt nothing except confusion and a growing frustration that he left me this puzzle without any pieces that actually fit together. When I finally climbed out and locked the warehouse behind me, I'd made a decision. I would try to find out why. I had a week before I needed to be back in Chicago. I would spend that week understanding what the persistence meant, why my grandfather had kept it, why he'd never sailed it, and then I would decide what to do with it. I started with the neighbors. Mrs. Henderson, who lived next door to my grandfather's house, was in her 80s and had lived on the street since 1975. She invited me in, made sweet tea that was aggressively Southern, and talked about Thomas Brennan with the careful neutrality of someone who'd been neighbors with someone for nearly 50 years without ever really knowing them. He was private, she said, polite, never caused any trouble, kept his property nice. But private. After Margaret died, that was your grandmother. He just sort of withdrew. Used to see him leave every Saturday morning, come back in the afternoon. Same routine for years. Where did he go? That warehouse of his, I assume. That's where he always said he was going when anyone asked. Working on his boat. I asked him once why he didn't just keep it in the water, save himself the trouble. He said it wasn't that kind of boat. What did he mean? She shrugged. No idea. Like I said, he didn't elaborate much. I tried other neighbors with similar results. Everyone had the same story. Thomas Brennan was quiet, private, consistent, and completely unremarkable, except for his dedication to a boat he never sailed. No one knew why. No one had asked, or if they had, they'd received answers that didn't satisfy and hadn't pursued it further. The VFW post was next. My grandfather had been a member, had served in Vietnam, had received an honorable discharge in 1968. The post commander, a man named Gillespie, who looked like he'd been carved from leather and cigarettes, remembered him vaguely. Came to meetings maybe once a month, Gillespie said, pulling out a dusty membership roster. Paid his dues, participated in the flag ceremonies on holidays, but didn't socialize much. Some of the vets, they need the community, you know. Need to talk about it with people who understand. Your grandfather wasn't like that. He'd done his service, come home, moved on. Or at least that's how it seemed. Did he ever talk about the war? Not that I heard. Some guys don't. They compartmentalize, lock it away, get on with things. Doesn't mean it's not there. Just means they're not sharing it. Did he ever mention a boat? Gillespie thought for a moment. Actually, yeah. One time, this was probably 15 years ago, someone was talking about taking their kids fishing, and your grandfather said he had a boat, but didn't use it for fishing. Someone made a joke, asked what he used it for then, and he said something strange. Said he used it for remembering. Didn't explain what that meant. We all figured it was some kind of memorial thing, maybe for someone who died, but we didn't push. You don't push with vets. They share what they want to share. Used it for remembering. That phrase stuck with me as I continued my investigation. The boat wasn't for sailing. It was for remembering. But remembering what? Or whom? I went to the library and searched through old newspapers on microfiche, looking for anything about Thomas Brennan or the Persistence. I found nothing useful. A few mentions in the Machinist Union newsletter. An article about the factory where he'd worked closing in 1980, but nothing about boats or plans to sail or any incident that might explain this fixation. I contacted the sailing school in Key West, the one from the brochure. They still existed, somewhat miraculously, though under different management. After explaining the situation, I was connected to a woman named Clara, who'd worked there since the 1970s. Thomas Brennan, she said slowly, searching her memory. I don't remember that name specifically, but we had hundreds of students over the years. Do you have any other details? He had a brochure from 1979, suggesting he was planning to take classes that September. I'm trying to figure out if he actually attended. I heard papers shuffling. Our records from that far back are spotty, but let me check. More shuffling. Here's September 1979. We had 18 students enrolled in the basic sailing course that month. No Thomas Brennan on the list. But we had a lot of people sign up and then cancel last minute. Life gets in the way, you know. Life gets in the way. That seemed to be the story. My grandfather had planned to learn to sail, had bought a boat in preparation, and then something had prevented him from following through. But what? And why had he kept the boat? I spent an evening going through the financial records more carefully, looking for clues. The boat had been purchased in August 1979 for $18,000, a significant sum at the time. The warehouse lease started that same month. And right around the same time, there was a large withdrawal from savings, $25,000, with a notation that just said, estate settlement, estate settlement. I pulled out my phone and called my father, something I'd been avoiding because our relationship was barely better than his relationship with his father had been. David, he answered, his voice wary. How's Biloxi? Complicated. Dad, I need to ask you about something. In 1979, there was a large financial transaction in Grandpa's accounts. $25,000 marked as estate settlement. Do you know what that was about? Silence on the line. Then, why are you going through his financial records? Because I'm trying to understand something. There's a boat. The boat, my father said, and something in his tone suggested he knew about it, and maybe always known about it. Of course there's the boat. You know about it? I know he bought it. I know he never used it. I know it was connected to Michael. Who's Michael? Another long silence. My brother. Your uncle. He died in 1977. That estate settlement was probably from life insurance or VA benefits or something. Michael was in the Navy. I sat down hard in my grandfather's desk chair. I have an uncle who died. Why did no one ever tell me this? Because it's not something we talk about, my father said, his voice tight. It's not something Dad ever talked about. Michael died. Mom couldn't handle it, and she was gone within 6 months. Heart attack, officially, but really it was grief. And Dad ... just shut down. Stopped being a father. Stopped being anything except someone going through the motions. That's why we're estranged. Not because of some argument, but because after Michael and Mom died, there was nothing left of him to have a relationship with. He was just this hollow thing, and I couldn't stand being around it. Michael was in the Navy, I said slowly, understanding beginning to form. And Grandpa bought a boat 2 years after Michael died. Yeah? A boat he never sailed? A boat he spent 40 years maintaining. A boat that was probably supposed to be for some trip they were going to take together, some plan they'd made. And when Michael died, Dad couldn't let go of the plan, but he also couldn't execute it. So he just ... kept the boat ready, waiting for a trip that would never happen. I thanked my father and ended the call, and I sat in the quiet house thinking about grief and how different people carry it. Some people collapse under it. Some people run from it. And some people, apparently, spend 40 years maintaining a boat they'll never sail because it's the only way they know to keep faith with the dead. The next morning, I went back to the warehouse with new purpose. I searched the boat more carefully, looking for evidence of Michael, some trace of the person this vessel was really for. And I found it, tucked in a locker beneath the berth. A Navy dress uniform, carefully preserved in plastic, with a name tape reading Brennan, and beneath the uniform, a photo album. I sat on the berth and opened the album. It told a story in pictures. Michael Brennan as a child, grinning gap-toothed at the camera. As a teenager, tall and serious. In his Navy uniform, young and proud. And in the last few photos, on a ship, looking older than his years, the brightness gone from his eyes, replaced by something harder and more distant. There was a letter too, folded and refolded so many times the creases had worn thin. It was dated June 1977, written in a young man's careful handwriting, and it was addressed to Dad. I'm writing this from somewhere I can't name, doing things I can't talk about. But I wanted you to know that when this tour is done, when I'm finally home for good, I want us to take that trip we always talked about. You and me, a boat, the Gulf Coast, maybe down to the Keys, just sailing, fishing, not thinking about anything except being on the water together. I know I haven't been the best son these last few years. I know I've been distant, hard to reach, but that's going to change. When I get home, we'll have time. All the time in the world. We'll buy that boat you're always looking at in the magazines, and we'll just go. That's a promise, Dad. When I get home, we'll go. Michael never came home. There was a newspaper clipping in the album, a small article from the Biloxi Sun-Herald dated September 1977. Local sailor dies in training accident. The details were vague: an accident during exercises. No specifics provided. Funeral to be held at the VFW post. Michael Brennan, age 24, survived by his parents Thomas and Margaret. I sat there with the letter and the album and understood, finally, what the persistence meant. It was the promise kept and the promise broken, both at once. Michael had promised they would go sailing when he came home. Thomas had bought the boat in preparation for that trip, using the money from his dead son's life insurance. But Michael never came home, and Margaret died from grief, and Thomas was left alone with a boat that represented both the future they planned and the future that would never arrive. So he kept it. He maintained it. He made sure it was always ready for the voyage they'd never take. It was his way of honoring Michael, of keeping the promise, even though the promise was impossible to keep. The boat would never sail, because Michael would never sail it. But it would also never be sold or abandoned or allowed to deteriorate, because that would mean accepting that the promise was truly dead, that the future was truly canceled, that Michael was truly gone. For 43 years, Thomas Brennan had gone to that warehouse every week and maintained a boat for a son who would never return, preparing for a journey that would never begin. It was devotion and it was madness, and it was love expressed in the only way he knew how: through action, through routine, through the faithful maintenance of an object that stood in for everything he'd lost. I closed the album and sat in the cabin of the Persistence, surrounded by the careful preparations of a grieving father, and I cried for the first time since learning my grandfather had died. I cried for Michael, who'd made a promise he couldn't keep. I cried for Margaret, who died of a broken heart. I cried for Thomas, who'd spent 4 decades keeping faith with a dream that had died with his son. And I cried for myself, for the family I'd never known I'd lost, for the uncle I'd never met and the grandfather I'd never understood. When I finally composed myself, I knew what I had to do. The boat couldn't stay in the warehouse forever. My grandfather was gone, and there was no one left to maintain it, no one who would honor his ritual. But I also couldn't bear to simply sell it or scrap it, to treat it as just another asset to be liquidated from the estate. I called a marine salvage company and asked about the feasibility of launching a boat that had been in dry dock for 4 decades. The man I spoke with was skeptical, but interested. It was an unusual request. After I explained the situation, he agreed to come look at it. His name was Rodriguez, and he'd been in the marine business for 30 years. He arrived at the warehouse 2 days later, inspected the Persistence thoroughly, and whistled low when he finished. "This boat is in better condition than most boats I see that are actively sailed," he said. "Your grandfather knew what he was doing. The hull is solid, the engine's been maintained perfectly, the systems are all in good shape. With some minor work, new hoses, fresh fluids, some electrical updates, this boat could be launched tomorrow." "Could it actually sail?" I asked. "Absolutely. It's ready. It's been ready for 40 years. Question is, what do you want to do with it?" I'd been thinking about that. "I want to take it out. Once. I want to sail it. Just once. And then, I don't know. Maybe donate it to a sailing program for veterans or something. But first, I need to take it out. I need to finish what my grandfather started." Rodriguez nodded. "I can help with that." "But you know how to sail?" "No," I admitted, "but I'll learn. Or I'll hire someone who can teach me." We made arrangements. Rodriguez would do the necessary work to make the boat seaworthy, which would take about a week. I would extend my stay in Biloxi, take a crash course in basic sailing, and then we would launch the Persistence, and I would take it out on the Gulf, completing the voyage. It had been built for 43 years earlier. I found a sailing instructor willing to do intensive daily lessons, a retired Coast Guard officer named Patterson, who ran a small sailing school out of the harbor. When I explained what I was trying to do, he waived his usual fees and said he'd be honored to help. "Your grandfather was keeping faith," he said. "That matters. We should honor that." For the next week, I split my time between learning to sail and watching Rodriguez work on the boat. The sailing lessons were frustrating and exhilarating in equal measure. I'd never realized how physical sailing was, how much coordination and timing it required, how much knowledge you needed about wind and weather and navigation. But Patterson was patient, and I was motivated, and by the end of the week I could handle basic maneuvers, could understand what the boat was telling me through the helm, could read the wind and adjust the sails accordingly. The Persistence came together quickly under Rodriguez's skilled hands. He replaced hoses and fluids, updated some of the electrical systems, checked and rechecked every system. On the morning we were scheduled to launch, he pronounced it ready. A crane lifted the boat from its blocks, and for the first time in 43 years, the Persistence moved, swinging gently through the air before being lowered into the water at the marina. It settled into the Gulf like it had been there all along, floating perfectly, no leaks, no problems. It looked right on the water, looked like it had always belonged there, and I understood viscerally why my grandfather had maintained it so carefully. This was a beautiful boat, and seeing it finally in its element was profoundly satisfying. Patterson helped me prepare for departure, checking everything one more time, making sure I understood the plan. We would motor out of the harbor, raise sails in the Gulf, sail south for a few hours, and then return before sunset. Nothing ambitious, just a simple voyage, the kind of day sail that Michael and Thomas had probably planned decades ago. I'd placed the Navy uniform and the photo album in the cabin, along with a small urn I'd purchased. I'd had my grandfather cremated, and I'd saved a portion of the ashes for this. Patterson had raised his eyebrows, but hadn't asked questions when he'd seen me bring the urn aboard. We cast off at 9 in the morning, and I piloted the Persistence out of the harbor, engine thrumming reliably, bow cutting through calm water. Once we cleared the harbor, Patterson helped me raise the sails, and when the wind caught them and the boat heeled slightly and began to move under sail power, something happened that I hadn't expected. I felt my grandfather's presence, felt him there with me in a way that was more than memory or imagination, as if he'd been waiting for this moment as long as I had, as if the boat had been waiting not just for Michael, but for someone, anyone, to finally complete this journey. We sailed south, the Mississippi coast receding behind us, nothing ahead but blue water and sky. The persistence handled beautifully, responsive and steady, proving that 43 years of maintenance had been worth it. Patterson gave me instructions and encouragement, but mostly he let me sail, let me figure out the relationship between wind and water and boat. Let me experience what my grandfather had prepared for, but never done. After about 2 hours, I asked Patterson to take the helm. I went below to the cabin and retrieved the urn and the photo album. I brought them up to the deck and sat looking at them, at the physical remnants of my grandfather's grief and devotion. Patterson, understanding without needing explanation, said, "Take your time." I opened the album one more time, looking at Michael's young face, at the promise in his eyes before the Navy had taken it from him. I read his letter again, the promise to come home and go sailing with his father, the promise that death had prevented him from keeping. "He kept faith with you," I said to the photo, to Michael, to whatever remained of him in the universe. For 43 years, he kept faith. The boat was always ready. He was always ready. He just couldn't go without you. I stood and scattered my grandfather's ashes over the side, watching them settle on the water, watching the Gulf claim what was left of Thomas Brennan, bringing him finally to the place he prepared for, but never reached. And then, on impulse, I opened the urn's remaining portion and scattered some of those ashes as well, mixing them with the water, symbolically bringing father and son together on the voyage they'd never taken in life. Patterson was quiet, respectful, giving me space for this private ritual. When I finished, he said simply, "That was good. That was right." We sailed for another hour, and then Patterson helped me turn the Persistence north, back toward Biloxi. The return voyage was quieter, more contemplative. I was thinking about promises and how we keep them, about grief and how it shapes us, about the different ways people honor the dead and maintain faith with the lost. My grandfather had spent 43 years keeping a boat ready for a voyage that would never happen. And from one perspective, it seemed like waste, like a man trapped by grief, unable to move forward, unable to let go. But from another perspective, it seemed like devotion, like love expressed through the only language he knew, like a promise kept even when keeping it was impossible. We docked at sunset, the Persistence returning to harbor as the sky turned orange and purple. Rodriguez was waiting, and he helped us secure the boat. Patterson shook my hand and said, "Your grandfather would be proud. You did right by him." I stayed on the boat for a while after they left, sitting in the cabin, feeling the gentle rocking of the water, understanding for the first time what my grandfather must have felt during those decades of visits, the connection to something lost, the comfort of routine, the way caring for this object became a way of caring for memory itself. The next day, I made arrangements to donate the Persistence to a veteran sailing program in Mobile. They were thrilled to receive it, said they'd use it to teach sailing to vets, dealing with PTSD and other service-related trauma, that being on the water had therapeutic value that was hard to replicate any other way. The boat would finally be used for its intended purpose, would finally serve rather than just wait. Before signing over the title, I removed the photo album and Michael's letter. Those were family artifacts, not meant for strangers. Everything else, the uniform, the carefully maintained equipment, the boat itself went to the program, where it would begin a new life, a new story, while still honoring the old one. I spent my last day in Biloxi at the house, finishing the sorting, arranging for estate sales and donations, closing out the physical space my grandfather had occupied. And I thought about the boat that never left the harbor, about what it meant, about what it taught me. We made promises to others, to ourselves, to the future we imagine. And sometimes circumstances break those promises, make them impossible to keep. When that happens, we have choices. We can abandon the promise, declare it void, move on to other things. Or we can keep faith with it anyway, finding ways to honor the intention, even when the specific action is impossible. My grandfather chose the latter. He couldn't sail with Michael, couldn't take the trip they'd planned, couldn't bring his son back or undo his death. But he could keep the boat ready. He could maintain it as if the trip were still possible, as if Michael might walk through the warehouse door tomorrow and say, "Dad, let's go." It was a fiction, a fantasy, a refusal to accept reality. But it was also faith, devotion, love that persisted beyond reason. The boat never left the harbor during my grandfather's lifetime, but it left his hands in perfect condition, ready for the next chapter, the next promise, the next voyage. And in a way, that was its own kind of success, its own validation of all those years of maintenance. Nothing is wasted if it's done with love. Nothing is pointless if it maintains connection to what matters. I left Biloxi on a Wednesday morning, my rental car packed with a few items I'd kept from the estate photos, the album my grandfather's careful financial records that told the story of a life lived in service to a promise. I drove past the warehouse one last time, seeing the empty unit, the space where the Persistence had sat for 4 decades. The boat was gone, finally on the water where it belonged, beginning the adventures it had been built for. And my grandfather was gone, his ashes scattered on the Gulf, finally taking the voyage he'd prepared for all those years. The promise was kept and broken simultaneously, fulfilled in a way no one could have predicted, but everyone could recognize as true. I thought about my own life as I drove north toward the airport. What promises was I keeping or avoiding? What boats was I maintaining in dry dock, always preparing for voyages I never took? What dreams was I honoring, and what dreams was I just preserving in amber, too afraid to attempt them, but too attached to abandon them? The boat that never left the harbor was a cautionary tale and an inspiration, both at once. It warned against getting so caught up in preparation that you never act, against letting fear or grief or perfectionism prevent you from ever beginning. But it also testified to the value of faithfulness, of showing up consistently for what matters, of maintaining readiness even when circumstances seem hopeless. My grandfather had maintained that boat for 43 years, and in the end, it had sailed. Not with him, and not with Michael, but it had sailed. The promise was kept, just not in the way anyone expected. And maybe that was enough. Maybe the point wasn't whether the specific plan worked out, but whether you kept faith with the underlying intention, whether you honored what mattered, even when the form had to change. I flew back to Chicago with these thoughts tumbling through my mind, and when I returned to my apartment, to my job, to my routine, I found myself looking at my life differently. I had my own boats in dry dock projects I'd been planning forever, but never starting. Dreams I kept polished, but never pursued. Promises I'd made to myself that I was always about to keep, but never actually kept. The difference between my grandfather and me was that he'd had a reasoned grief, loss, the impossibility of doing what he'd planned without the person he'd planned it with. I didn't have that excuse. I was just afraid, just cautious, just endlessly preparing instead of ever doing. So I made a decision. I would honor my grandfather's devotion by not repeating his pattern. I would take the boats off the blocks, launch them, sail them, even if I sailed them badly, even if the voyage didn't go as planned. Because the point wasn't perfection, it was participation, engagement, the willingness to actually do rather than just prepare. I signed up for a writing class I'd been considering for years. I called a friend I'd been meaning to reconnect with, and actually made plans instead of just saying we should get together sometime. I started training for a marathon I'd always said I'd run eventually. Small things maybe, but things that moved from intention to action, from preparation to execution. And I thought about my grandfather often, about his weekly visits to that warehouse, about his careful maintenance of a vessel that never moved. I understood him better now. He wasn't trapped or deluded or wasting his time. He was keeping faith, maintaining connection, honoring love in the only way he knew how. The boat never left the harbor during his lifetime, but it left his hands perfect, ready, capable of everything it was meant to do. That was enough. That had to be enough. And it was more than enough. It was everything. The whole story of a life lived in devotion to promises kept. And people loved and dreams maintained even when the world made those dreams impossible. The Persistence sailed, eventually. It just took 43 years, and a voyage not with the people originally intended, but with someone who understood what it meant, who honored what it represented. And maybe that's how promises work. They get kept, but rarely in the way we imagined, rarely with the people we expected, rarely on the timeline we planned. They get kept by whoever shows up to honor them, by whoever understands their value, by whoever finally has the courage to cast off the lines and sail into whatever comes next. I keep a photo on my desk now the Persistence on the water, sails full, bow, cutting through the gulf, finally doing what it was built for. And beneath it, I keep my grandfather's final financial record, the last line item for the warehouse lease, paid in full through the end, faithful to the last. The boat that never left the harbor is sailing now, carrying veterans toward healing, creating new memories, serving new purposes. And my grandfather is part of those waters, scattered where the boat finally sailed, keeping watch over the vessel he maintained for so long, knowing that his devotion wasn't wasted, that his promise was kept, that the voyage he couldn't take himself has been taken by others in his name. That's legacy. That's love. That's what it means to keep faith with the impossible, to honor the dead by living well, to turn grief into something that serves the living rather than just mourning the lost. The boat that never left the harbor taught me all of this, and I'm grateful for the lesson, and I'm grateful to the grandfather I never understood until it was too late to tell him. But maybe he knows anyway. Maybe he's been knowing all along, waiting patiently like that boat in the warehouse, ready for someone to finally understand what he was doing, why it mattered, what it meant. And now someone does. Now I do. And the boat is sailing, and the promise is kept, and the story that seemed like tragedy has become something else, something about devotion and faith and love that persists beyond death, beyond reason, beyond hope itself, until finally, impossibly, the boat leaves the harbor and the voyage begins.